Tell them that I have had a wonderful life. These were the last words that Wittgenstein said to his friend Bertrand Russell on his deathbed.
Abe, wonderful life. Tell me about it.
It's not that simple. At first glance, his life was not great. Ludwig Wittgenstein was one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, but most people did not know about him during his lifetime.
People who truly make a difference are only recognized after their death.
For him, philosophy was vital, although you can understand his philosophy without knowing his life. His theories do not relate directly to his personal experience, but philosophy was very important to him personally. Being a philosopher was not a profession, but something he felt he had to do, to ask questions and look for answers.
But what was so special in his life that led him to these questions?
Wittgenstein came from a wealthy, educated Austrian family. Wittgenstein's father was a strong personality and a self-made man. After years of traveling in the US, he founded one of the largest steel companies in Austria. At the age of 55, he retired from business, promoted art and took care personally of the education of his children. At first, they did not attend any school. He later tried to get Ludwig into school anyway, but no school in Vienna would accept him. He did not fulfill the requirements. So he ended up at a small school in Linz, where another man who later became famous also happened to be, Adolf Hitler. There's a photo with maybe both of them. However, it is unlikely that they had any closer contact as they did not attend the same class. They were the same age and even born in the same month, but Hitler was one grade behind.
And Wittgenstein didn't go into politics?
He admired the journalist and satirist Karl Kraus. Kraus was a fierce critic of nationalist ideas and corruption in politics. But Wittgenstein wanted to become an aeroplane engineer. He was also very interested in math and logic. At his time, there was an attempt to give mathematics a foundation through logic. This was called Logicism. The most important representative of this movement was Gottlob Frege, whom Wittgenstein visited in Jena. Frege recommended that he go to Cambridge to study with Bertrand Russell, which Wittgenstein did.
And then he became a philosopher?
Not so fast. Wittgenstein wasn't sure what he wanted to be. Russell advised him to study philosophy. However, Wittgenstein was not interested in an academic career. Instead, he only wanted to deal with the problems that interested him. He retired to Norway and built a wooden hut with his own hands, where he lived. He began writing his Tractatus, the only philosophical book to be published during his lifetime. He worked on the Tractatus for 7 years. It is one of the most important works of logic. Wittgenstein urged Moore, who was already a respected philosopher at the time, to come to Norway. Wittgenstein treated him like a secretary and became furious if he was not satisfied with Moore. He wrote a first draft, which he called Logic, and submitted it to Cambridge for his bachelor's degree. However, his Logic was rejected. The reason given was that it did not have a preface or footnotes. A furious Wittgenstein wrote to Moore,
"If I'm not worth your making an exception for me even in some stupid details, then I may as well go to hell directly. And if I'm worth it and you don't do it, then, by God, you might go there."
In the meantime, the First World War broke out. Wittgenstein volunteered, not as an officer, where his father had got him a job, but as a private second class. His father arranged for him to join an artillery regiment, because he would be further away from the front and therefore safer. But Wittgenstein volunteered as a scout. He went far behind the front line into no man's land to spy on enemy positions. His courage saw him rise from private to officer. And it was with the same courage that he pursued his philosophy in the Tractatus. The fact became a proposition and finally a thought.
But what is his theory about?
In the Tractatus, Wittgenstein shows the limits of logic. He says what can be said logically.
And whereof one cannot speak, one must be silent.
This includes aesthetic and ethical judgments. This limit is only briefly mentioned at the beginning and at the end of the treatise, but for Wittgenstein it is central.
There must have been a reason for that.
His world consists of facts that cannot be said. One of these was his homosexuality, which was forbidden at the time. Homosexuals were regarded as crazy or criminals. Wittgenstein tried first to be asexual. He read a book by Otto Weininger, which inspired him. He gave the book all his friends in Cambridge and told them that they should definitely read it too. However, the book is obscure and his friends couldn't make any sense of it. Wittgenstein had no doubt that discrimination against his homosexuality was unacceptable. He also realized that his homosexuality needed no justification. After all, feelings are facts about which one cannot be mistaken. He was deeply convinced of the correctness of his beliefs, but they cannot be expressed through language. Logic cannot grasp them either. Once he discovered the limits on logic, he stopped philosophy. For him, the work was done, as he himself wrote in the Tractatus.
He who understands me finally recognizes them as senseless when he has climbed out through them, on them, over them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up on it.
He often thought about suicide and talked about it a lot. 3 of his brothers had already killed themselves. But a passage in the Tractatus explains why suicide is impossible. Suicide only exists for an outside observer, or in his own words,
Death is not an event of life. Death is not lived through.
If you come from a rich family, you have other ways of solving problems.
Wittgenstein inherited a fortune from his father. However, he didn't want any of it and gave it all away. He supported poets like Trakel, who wanted to meet his sponsor. However, when Trakel took his own life shortly before their meeting, Wittgenstein gave up being a patron. He gave all his money to his siblings.
How could he do that? It was a fortune.
The notary didn't understood it either and said to him that he wanted to commit a financial suicide. After the war, he spent the summer working in the garden of a monastery. Already his grandmother converted from the Jewish faith to Catholicism. Wittgenstein was religious. But if he was close to one religion, it was Christianity. He loved reading Tolstoy's interpretation of the Gospels and thought about joining a monastery for good. He eventually became a teacher in a small school in the Austrian countryside. He was not suited to the job. Former pupils described him as grumpy. As a school teacher, Wittgenstein wrote a dictionary for primary schools. This book was intended to teach children the correct pronunciation. Apart from the treatise, it is the only book that was published during Wittgenstein's lifetime. Its value today is mainly as a collector's item. Only a few copies have survived. A first edition was sold a few years ago for £70,000.
And what happened to the Tractatus?
Wittgenstein soon had his first admirers. One of them was Ramsay, a student from Cambridge. He visited Wittgenstein in Austria and was surprised by his ascetic life.
Wittgenstein's family are very rich and extremely anxious to give him money or do anything for him in any way. And he rejects all their advances. Even Christmas presents or presents of invalid's food when he is ill he sends back. And this is not because they aren't on good terms, but because he won't have any money he hasn't earned.
Yet, Wittgenstein chose to live in poverty. He never entered a monastery, but he lived very much like a monk. Later, he had the habit of making confessions in front of a group of friends, just as it is customary in a monastery in a chapter house. A monk is obliged to declare all his sins, and so Wittgenstein also confessed everything he considered to be a sin. This included, for example, white lies.
Oh.
But Wittgenstein was no saint. After hitting a pupil, he had to give up teaching because of the parents' protests. Wittgenstein went back to Vienna, where he worked as an architect, and built a house for his sister. He designed all the details of the house himself. Every window, every radiator and door handle was designed by him. The style of the house is similar to that of the architect Adolf Loos, who also came from Austria. Loos gave a famous lecture, ornament and crime, which is very similar to Wittgenstein's ideas. Loos rejected everything decorative, which he felt was unnecessary, and wanted to get down to the essentials. Details are also very important to Loos.
But Wittgenstein seemed to overlook the detail that the Tractatus found no readers.
People were getting more interested in his Tractatus without Wittgenstein doing anything about it. The Vienna Circle was highly regarded at the time. It was a group of Austrian philosophers who tried to give philosophy a scientific foundation by using logic. They were fascinated by the Tractatus. It was the first complete attempt to develop a logical language. They read the Tractatus to each other and discussed it. Wittgenstein met some members several times, but he never became a member himself of the Vienna Circle. Carnap, one of the leading philosophers of the Vienna Circle, later said that Wittgenstein was the thinker who inspired him the most, although his way of approaching philosophical question was quite different.
His point of view and his attitude toward people and problems, even theoretical problems, were much more similar to those of a creative artist than to those of a scientist. One might almost say, similar to those of a religious prophet or a seer. When finally, sometimes after a prolonged, arduous effort, his answers came forth, his statements stood before us like a newly created piece of art or a divine revelation.
Ramsay wanted Wittgenstein to return to Cambridge to teach. But there was a problem. Wittgenstein had never graduated or even taken any exam. He had been undergraduate at Cambridge and only attended Russell and Moore's courses. And apart from Russell, he only read Frege. Despite this, he didn't have any problems and was respected by everyone. Today you would never get away with that, no matter what university you go to. Without having a degree, he still got his doctorate for the Tractatus in 1929. After defending his thesis, he patted one of the examiners, the philosopher Moore, on the shoulder and said,
"Don't worry, I know you'll never understand it."
Moore wrote in his examiner report,
I myself consider that this is a work of genius. But even if I am completely mistaken, and it is nothing of the sort, it is well above the standard required for the PhD degree.
Wittgenstein started to question if he had done everything correctly in the Tractatus. He was no longer so sure. So he started working at the problems of the Tractatus again and searching for new answers. Where's the limit of language? Eventually he started teaching as a lecturer and later became a professor at Cambridge. The decision was certainly influenced by his relationship to Francis Skinner, the love of his life. He convinced Skinner to leave his studies at Cambridge and work as a mechanic. They stayed together until Skinner died from polio in 1941. Wittgenstein kept working on his problems with the limits of language and formulated a new theory. At first he thought that concepts were like images of objects. Now he took the view that concepts are rather sets. He calls them families. Everyone has their own idea of a concept which is similar to the one of others, but not identical to them.
Explaining that requires another video that you should make.
During the Second World War, the Nazis said the Wittgensteins were Jewish, even though they had been Christians for 3 generations. But 3 grandparents were born Jewish. And above all, they had a fortune, and the Nazis wanted to take their money. Wittgenstein applied for and was granted British citizenship. For 8 years he was a professor at Cambridge. He was an unusual professor. He refused to eat at the elevated table for professors in the dining room. Instead, he sat with the students downstairs. If a talented student said that they wanted to become a professional philosopher, Wittgenstein would get very angry.
Don't look at me. I don't want to become a professional philosopher.
In Cambridge, Wittgenstein started writing again. But everything he wrote remained fragments. He dictated some of these to his students. These texts were copied and circulated at the university. It was only after his death that his students published them. In his youth, he was still convinced that he could create a logical language, but later he was no longer sure of this. He realized that words are not simply images. words cannot be defined. The exact designation is vague and depends on the context. Wittgenstein rejects the idea of a private language, where only the speaker knows exactly what it means. The meaning of words are family resemblances. For Wittgenstein, there was no separation between life and science. He knew that an objective, external perspective was impossible. And yet, he spent his entire life running up against this boundary, which he refused to accept.
So, did he have a wonderful life?
For him, there was no difference between his philosophy and his life. He lived his life to the full. He wanted to find answers to his questions without compromising his beliefs. And he made no compromises in his life either. He did not engage in philosophy to become successful. Instead, he gave away his money and refused any honors. For him, that was a life well lived.
I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe and see you next time.